And Russia's annual Victory Day parade is currently underway in Moscow. These are live images that we are getting from Moscow. We are expecting heavy military machinery to soon begin rolling through Red Square. Now, this year's spectacle marks the 80th anniversary of the Soviet Union's defeat of Nazi Germany.
Министр обороны поздравил парадные расчеты воздушно-космических сил. Личный состав воздушно-космических сил.
More than 24 foreign leaders are attending the parade, the Kremlin says, including China's Xi Jinping and Brazil's Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Ukraine has said that the foreign participation is a show of support for Russia's war in Ukraine. And for more on this, we can now talk to DW correspondent Vladimir Esipov. Vladimir, welcome. What would you say is so significant about this year's Victory Day parade?
Well, it's the 80th anniversary, as you mentioned already. It's a huge foreign presence with 20 states of 20 head of states from all across the world, from global south, especially from China, which is extremely important for Russia as a signal to domestic audience and the foreign audience as well. And it will be the biggest military parade since many years. It will be a flyover, which was cancelled a couple of years ago because of Ukrainian drones attacking Moscow. So for Russia, it's a show of force and a show of national unity on this very important day, because it's simply the biggest national holiday in Russia today.
You also talked about this signal to a domestic audience. I mean, Russia celebrates this day as its victory over Nazi Germany. Are there echoes of that victory in the present time that Russia is using to signal something to its domestic audience?
Yes, it's a day of remembering of fallen 25 million Soviet citizens during the Second World War. And in the second time, and in the same time, it's a very clear link to the current happenings in the Ukraine, because Russian state government established the link between the war in the Ukraine right now and the Second World War 80 years ago. So it kind of reframed the history for foreign purposes, for the military purposes in the neighborhood country.
I mean, it's quite a play on history, isn't it, Vladimir? I mean, you're talking about the Soviet Union, which was attacked by a foreign power, Nazi Germany, 80 years ago. And now 80 years later, Russia is doing the very same to Ukraine, arguably. And I just wonder, do Russians accept that narrative? Do they believe that that is indeed what is happening now?
Well, it's difficult for me to talk to all Russians, but I mean, bigger chunk of the Russian public truly accept this narrative from the state media. And I'm sure that other parts of Russian public, among my family, for example, would not accept this, because for my family, and I'm personally affected by this history, because my father survived the siege of Leningrad during the Second World War, and part of my family was in the city. I'm just thinking of them, and I'm thinking I would not be able to explain them this connection between the defeating Nazis 80 years ago and fighting the Ukrainians, which were on the same front with Russians, with many other nationals from the Soviet Union in the time. So it's just, as absurd as it sounds, it's just not possible to me just to get the link between the Second World War and the war in Ukraine, because for me, it's completely two different stories.
And just a reminder, viewers, they're seeing live images from Red Square in Moscow, where the Victory Parade is currently underway. Vladimir, there's also, you mentioned there's some foreign heads of state that are also attending. Prime amongst them obviously has to be President Xi Jinping of Russia.
Of China.
How would you, of China, I'm sorry. How would you describe China-Russia ties 3 years into this war in Ukraine?
It's extremely important sign of support from the Chinese government, from the Chinese state leader to the Russian leadership, because China is supporting Russia war in Ukraine with dual-use technologies, with buying Russian oil and gas, and creating income for Russian state budget. So Russia was able to stabilize its economy, to increase the sales of commodities to countries like China and India as well. So for President Putin, it's a clear show of force, hosting such a foreign leader as a Chinese president in Moscow on that very important day, showing to the world and to the domestic audience that Russia and China together are overcoming the Western dominance in the ideological and the political way. So the time of American dominance, according to Putin and Xi Jinping probably, are over.
You know, we've also been talking about a ceasefire potentially. There's been talk back and forth. There have been meetings that have been held between the United States and Russia. There is talk of potentially bilateral meeting between the Russians and the Ukrainians. Where does China stand on that?
Well, it's a lot of movements behind the carpet, as the Russians saying. It is a lot of noise, but it's not really happening something. So we're still waiting for the results of these negotiations, which are obviously going on since weeks, or if not months. It's difficult to say which role China would play in this, but for a Chinese leader attending these happenings in Moscow for 4 consecutive days, right now the state visit will be long 4 days, it's a hugely show of support for Russia.
Is it in China's interest that this war continues?
Well, I would think it's in China's interest to show that the world is not dominated by the US anymore. So Russia and China can form a kind of political economic alliance to be an alternative to the US to the US dominance, and the show up of the leaders of the so-called global South in these happenings in Moscow. There are 20 of them. It's an additional signal that Russia and China offering a kind of alternative agenda to the world.
I just wanted to ask you one final question, Vladimir. You're also the author of a book called The Russian Tragedy. I know we're looking at visuals of Victory Day coming out of Moscow. Does this look like victory or does this look like a tragedy?
It was a tragedy 80 years ago because 25 million of Soviet people died. And from all I know from my relatives, I hear from my grandmother, she was in St. Petersburg during the war. It was nothing about heroism. It was about mass dying. It was about dead bodies piling up on the streets of our city. So it was a huge tragedy for the Soviet people.